Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tatiana Melema, and I am the Curator of Academic Programs at the Morrison Helen Belkin Art Gallery. And I'm here today with one of our panelists, John Kozachenko. And we're in the AIDS Vancouver office here, who's kindly shared their space with us today. And I would like to, before we begin the event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I know that many of us are joining from different locations today. So I'd like to invite you in the chat to actually share with us whose lands you are joining from today. And before we begin, I also want to let you know that this session is being recorded. And so this will be uploaded on our website after the event is finished. And we are really pleased to be together today on the occasion of the exhibition, Laiwan Traces, Erasures, and Resists. And this is an exhibition that's guest curated by Amy Kazmarchuk, and it's up on view at the Belkin until April 10th. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I definitely encourage you to do so. And this exhibition highlights Laiwan's works made between 1980 and 2000. And her work as a cultural activist since the early 1980s that included her contribution to queer, feminist, multicultural, and visual art print publications, and notably with activist collectives Angles and Kinesis. So Laiwan also served as an editor of Front Magazine from 1994 to 1997. And it is with this history in mind that we have partnered with the Western Front to present the event today. So I'd like to hand this over to Susan Gibb, Executive Director of the Western Front, to say a few words.
Thanks, Tatiana. So today's discussion, Erasures, Cultural Activism and Periodicals, will be moderated by Laiwan, a cultural activist, interdisciplinary artist, writer and educator whose wide-ranging practice has had a singular influence on Vancouver's artistic and cultural life. Her exploration of poetics and philosophy takes form in embodied, material and environmental ways. For the panel, she has invited former collaborators, Frederick Thomas Edwards, John Kozachenko, and Joyce Jenje Makwenda to reflect on the experience as activists and contributors to print periodicals in the 1980s and 90s. In particular, what was the space of consciousness, commons, and collaboration that fostered these publishing activities? What were the economic and cultural circumstances that propelled them into the work that they were doing and the work that they could continue to do today? This conversation looks to the pathways forged by activists who are drawn to print periodicals as a space of consciousness and who have fought against the erasure of experience from dominant discourse. We are very glad to host this discussion today and for the opportunity it provides to reflect on these periodicals of past from our vantage point of the current moment, in which the question of what and how information circulates has taken on new meaning through the advent of the digital. Laiwan, John, Frederick, and Joyce welcome questions from all of you gathered here today, so please feel free to share these in the chat as they arise. At the end of the conversation, we will be joined by Jay Parr, the Digital Publics Facilitator at the Belkin, who will bring these questions forward during a moderated question and answer. Following this, there will also be a chance to continue the conversation more informally and for a number of those in attendance to catch up with past colleagues and collaborators. This will take the form of a post-panel Zoom meeting, for which a link will be shared at the end. I'd now like to invite Laiwan to commence the conversation.
Many thanks, Susan. It is a great pleasure to be here today. And I especially want to thank Tatiana and Susan for organizing this event in collaboration with the Belkin Gallery and the Western Front, and in particular, all the folks who are helping us technically and behind the scenes today, Ben Wilson, Jay Parr, and Josephine Wang. I also want to acknowledge that I'm calling from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, what is known as Vancouver, Canada. It is with great privilege that I'm here, and also that I found refuge here, leaving the war in Rhodesia at the height of the war in 1977, and this is one of the places that, the only place that accepted my family to come and live here. So it is with great honor that I acknowledge this. And from that, it's also focused my work in terms of the decolonial and in alliance with the local indigenous folks and across Canada, and also the indigenous peoples of Zimbabwe, the land where I was born. And yes, thank you all to all the participants who have signed on to the webinar today. I welcome you, and hopefully that we will have a lovely discussion. And also please join us for the post Zoom after Zoom party. Thank you. Welcome to Joyce, Frederick, and John, and for joining us with this conversation, Erasures, Cultural Activism, and Periodicals in the 1980s and 90s. Today's event is an opportunity to gain an overview and take stock of where we are today, in particular in relation to the significance of cultural activism and analog periodicals that were circulated to be freely picked up everywhere in Vancouver, and in Joyce's case, the international resources and support that was available to create publications in Zimbabwe. I am interested to see if we can reveal what spurred such activism, what did it build and develop, and what supports are needed for cultural activism today, in a time where free analog periodicals by community cultural activists are rare to find or non-existent. So I'll begin with the first question for each of the participants, which is, please introduce yourself. And I'm going to start with John. John, would you like to start?
Yes, my name is John Koshychenko. I'm a Canadian, born and raised in Toronto, but of Ukrainian descent. In Toronto, I grew up in the inner city. My mom ran a laundromat, Coin Up Laundry, so it was quite diverse, meeting people from many walks of life, close to the University of Toronto, the Art College of Ontario, University Avenue. So it was very progressive at that point in time because it was during the Vietnam War. Baldwin Street was happening, which is a lot of the draft resistance was centered there. When I was 14, May of 1970, I was curious, walking down the street and heard a ruckus. And it happened to be the Cambodian invasion protests at the US consulate, where I witnessed the police on horseback with their club swinging. At the time, the riot police were on horseback in Toronto. Is that it for that?
Yeah, just
very good.
Thank you, John. Let's go to Frederick. Oh, are you muted, Frederick?
There, I'm unmuted now. So my question is, tell you about myself a little bit.
Introduce yourself, thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm queer identified. I'm First Nations. I guess in terms of identity, I identify really as being part of the ZWICCT scoop. I was taken away from my birth family as a child and raised in a non-native family. It was pretty terrible, and but it sort of made it so I had no roots when I was young. And so I started drifting around. I ended up in Vancouver, and I lucked into John and Laiwan and the rest of the crew at the Angles. And they really fostered my love of graphic design and communication and media. And Laiwan especially gave me so many opportunities working at Kinesis, Western Front magazine, as well as Angles. And really encouraged me to self-teach myself a lot of the skills and carry on with this work, in which I've done in education, media. I've worked a little bit with UNESCO overseas in Africa. I worked with some contracts under HIV/AIDS project work in First Nations and Native American communities, as well as in education, post-secondary, primary, and secondary education.
And you currently are located where?
Oh, I'm located right now in Winnipeg. And right now I'm working a contract right now for the Manitoba First Nations school system, where I'm helping them with their communications publications.
Thank you, Fred. Joyce, would you like to introduce yourself? Are you muted? Yes.
My name is Joyce Jenje Makwenda. I'm from Zimbabwe. I live in Harare, where I grew up. Harare is the capital city of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe itself is a country which is found in Southern Africa. And Zimbabwe got its independence from the British in 1918 after a protracted war which saw many people dying in the country. I'm a researcher, producer, film documentary producer. I'm a journalist, an archivist, a lecturer, and a lot of other things. When I was growing up, I knew that I was into arts. I loved the arts, and I loved history. And as a woman, I knew that I had a place in this world. So these three things followed me through to where I am today, actually. I was very lucky to grow up in a family where stories were told. I'm the third generation in the township. When I'm talking about the township, this is a place where Black people lived in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Even now, they still live there, but then Black people have also moved to the suburban. So my paternal grandparents were amongst the early urban settlers in 1931 who settled in the township in Harare. And my father was the second generation, and I'm the third generation. So my father used to tell me a lot of stories about how urban settlers created their own culture, which created township music. My father was very much into music. Township music was the beginning of our popular music and jazz and township jazz. And my father was very much into jazz. And I was very much into rock music. So he used to talk so much about his time, his music, and comparing it with mine, comparing the way I used to dress, and his time. But then I didn't realize that one day what my father was talking about is something that I would do for the rest of my life. And when I was expecting my fourth child, this file, which was stored into my head by my father, just opened, and I started wanting to know how our township music started, how our popular music started. And it was from one musician to another. And then I realized that music is the umbrella of our society. Musicians talked about the first woman to do this, education, politics, and I followed through those topics. And now I sit on interviews, hundreds, thousands of interviews. It started with music, but now I also have what I call women's histories, where I've interviewed around 500 women. And with those women's histories, I've looked at politics, I've looked at education, I've looked at music, I've looked at journalism, film, sex and sexuality, because I want to create a whole woman. But I still research into music and township culture. I've written books, I've produced film documentaries, I gave lectures on the topics that I've talked about, and I also work for ZWICCT. I'm their current director.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. We will continue to find out all the fantastic work that you do through the next question. And so the next question is, in the 1980s, how did you become involved in community-based activism? What propelled you towards this? And how did you find the community group in which you joined or collaborated with? And again, I'm going to start with John.
Well, having been involved politically from Vietnam onwards, in the 70s and 80s, there was the anti-Greek junta protest, support for Morgenthaler. In 1978, I happened to have been in San Francisco when George Moscone and Harvey Milk were shot. 77, 79, I had traveled through Central America. And in the 80s, it was the bath raids in Toronto of February 5th, 1981. My other activism, which led me to Angle's newspaper, which I had friends who had been at protests with Richard Banner and Paul Craig, et cetera, and had joined Angle's, I guess, was 1988. Having been in that year, I had also been to Nicaragua during the Sandinista Revolution. So that's what brought me to work at Angle's newspaper, which I felt really fulfilled and satisfied with because it was a collective that worked by consensus. I had been involved in many other organizations, but not any that had worked by consensus, which is totally fulfilling, that no one loses, everyone gains.
Thank you, John. Something that I remember very clearly and with great fondness is you in the darkroom at Angle's. And was that darkroom there when you arrived, or did you develop that darkroom at Angle's?
No, I think it had been there, but we extended it, including to get a photomechanical transfer machine, which so we could print on our own. Yeah.
Right. So something that I remember about the Angle's offices was the availability of that darkroom for collective members to use, and also to learn about graphic design and help with layout. We also had dinners together during production. So we see a lot of your activism also across Vancouver in terms of working with ACT UP, etc. in the 80s. And we're remembering that the 80s was a time when it was just the beginning of the Reagan and Thatcher neoliberalism, and as well, not yet with the internet. So this is part of the reason I'd like to surface the environment and what it was like at that time. And thank you, John. We'll go to Frederick now, and remembering those times and meeting you.
So, how do we get involved? Okay. Well, for me, the period was like, I was just escaping from basically a traumatic experience from the 60s scoop with my family and stuff. I was like searching for who I was discovering, queer identity, First Nation identity. And I went out west and I started volunteering at Angle's. I started looking and getting involved in as many organizations that I could, community-based, poverty-based. I was learning photography, graphic design, and everything with the Angle's group, but I was also learning about which First Nation art groups were active in the community. And I was also interviewing people like, Billy Moracity, Gloria May Eshkabak, Sophia Moracity back in the day, covering what they were doing, just because I thought it was important to include that in the paper as well. I didn't really have a lot of direction or group. I sort of was on my own, and that's sort of the way I am, I guess. I'm not sure what else you want for this. So I think more of it comes in question 3.
Sure. I remember when we first met. I think you were 22, were you?
Mm-hmm.
You were quite young, and I was quite young. I think I was 28, and I think at Angle's we were learning how to work collectively, and there was quite a sense of bonding in terms of particularly the people of color, the Indigenous, and just all of us were looking for who could we find in the arts and culture who looked like us, or who sort of showed us a way for how to be creative in the world. At the age of 28, I then went to Zimbabwe, and that's where I also met Joyce. So Joyce, would you like to speak to this question? In the 1980s, how did you become involved in the work that you were doing?
As I've mentioned that I'm the third generation in the early urban culture. When I started doing the research on township music, township culture was not taken seriously. It was because it is a culture which involves a lot of people from different backgrounds, unlike what maybe we can call traditional culture, where a certain clan is at this place and they have certain ways of doing things. So township culture was not taken seriously. Actually, when I went to give a talk at the university, she said, you know what, I think you should be researching on our traditional culture. And I said, what is your tradition? What is our traditional culture? And they said maybe like the Shona or the Ndebele. But the township was a mixture of every people, all the people who came, maybe in Southern Africa, you would find a Shona person, and the Ndebele person, a Malawian, a Zambian, a South African. And for me, I grew up in that culture. And for me, that culture yet to be recognized. And that's why I documented and disseminated it. And I still do that today. And also women's histories, women were not really recognized when Zimbabwe became independent. The patriarchal system didn't recognize women as equal partners who had actually fought the war just like men had done. So that really affected me. And to see that women were not part of the political, social, and economical structures, and yet they fought just side by side with men. And in 1983, if you still remember, when women were rounded up at night for walking the streets of Harare and Bulawayo, I think, and some were coming from work, some were just enjoying the public space, and they were given all sorts of names, like when they were asked with the police, why did you arrest these women? They said they were prostitutes, and even if they were prostitutes, they were enjoying the space just like male prostitutes who were not arrested that time, you know. And some women were coming from work, and their husbands had to look for them, brothers, you know, children, and all that. And because of that, women became so angry, and then realized that they had to fight again. The war that they had fought to liberate Zimbabwe was another one. Now they had to fight the system. So I still remember the first women's group, one of the first women's group, which was started in 1983, was Women's Action Group, and I was part of that. Lucky enough, I don't know whether to say lucky enough or unfortunately, I was not in the streets, because I think I used to really go out myself, but then I'd become a full-time mother at that time. So I joined that group because I also wanted to add my voice to what was going on. And then a lot of other women's groups started coming up because women were really they wanted to challenge the system, the patriarchal structures, and to remind them that women were also human beings. And then in 1990, ZWICCT was formed, Zimbabwe Women Contemporary Culture Trust was formed, but ZWICCT took a different angle. ZWICCT, complementing other women's groups, but then it took a different angle where it started writing about women who have done something to improve their lives, who were talking by just doing deeds, women who sold vegetables around the corner and fed their family and looked after themselves. And from the grassroots to the highest echelons, ZWICCT wrote about those women who became also idols for other women and who sent the message to the patriarchal structures that women are also human beings. And I was co-opted in that group, ZWICCT, because I had also started researching on women, as I've already said, women's histories. And besides that group, besides that organization, I was also a member of women journalists, because we were also looking at how women journalists were working and how they were being abused where they worked or by the society itself. So that's how my activism was shaped in the 80s.
Thank you, Joyce. For those who don't know, Zimbabwe, before Zimbabwe was gained independence in 1980, it was Rhodesia, and there was apartheid in Rhodesia. So the white governments created these townships for Black folks to and people of color to live in. While they worked in the city, they weren't allowed to live in the city. They had to bus every day to the township, and that could take hours because there was really not very good transportation. So Joyce's focus on township culture was really important in the sense of sort of empowering the kind of culture that was developing in resistance to apartheid, white supremacy, and also in fervor of the vibrancy of Zimbabwean culture that could live within an apartheid system. So that is really important work that Joyce was doing. Thank you. I will go to the next question to give us an overview further of all of this activism. So the next question is, please describe what the environment was like 1980s and 1990s North America and 1980s and 1990s Zimbabwe. What was happening around you at the time, politically, culturally, socially, and what was your motivation and passion for what you were doing as a cultural activist? I realize some of you might have touched upon this in the previous question, but if there's anything additional you'd like to add. And in particular, periodicals that we're focusing upon today. And in the fourth question, we'll be talking a little bit about the digital. So that movement from printed matter, the importance of printed matter in your work in the 1980s. I will continue with Joyce. Joyce, would you like to speak about print?
Yeah, okay.
And also your work with the archives, because you have an archive that you've created in your home, but you've also worked a lot with what was then the Rhodesian archives, and then also the Zimbabwean archives.
I think talking about printed work, when I started doing this research, I was asked to write for newspapers, and I've written quite a lot. But before I started writing, maybe, or when I was writing for newspapers, I was looking for musicians, and some of them were not, I couldn't find them. But my mother, having been the second print Black journalist in Zimbabwe, she told me that, you know, some of the musicians that you are looking for, you might not find them. So go to the National Archives of Zimbabwe and you will find what we used to write. And I couldn't believe that, you know, stories which were written in the 50s still exist. And I went to the National Archives, and I couldn't believe what I saw. You know, because as I told you that when I started researching on township music, I was expecting my fourth child. And my fourth child grew up with this research. And when you phoned my home and you asked him, where is your mother? You would say, yes, at the archives. You knew now that I lived at the archives. And there was so much wealth of information. And not only just printed work, I also discovered videos which went as far back as the 40s, which I also used some of them for my documentary, Zimbabwe Township Music, which I produced in 1992. So the National Archives of Zimbabwe is one of the resourced archives in Africa, I think. It's during Rhodesia and even now, there is a lot of newspapers from the Herald started maybe earlier in the 20s. I'm not very sure, but it was not accessed by Black people. But the Bantu Mirror started in 1930s, which actually wrote about Black people, and in the 40s, other newspapers which actually wrote about and celebrated what was happening in the township, like the daily newspapers. That is where I did most of my research. And the National Archives of Zimbabwe is a place where I would encourage many people to go. And because of that, the research that I've also done, I ended up having my own archive. As I told you, I've said that I have thousands of interviews. I even interviewed Ian Smith, despite not liking him. But I said to myself, he will not go with this information to his grave. And I interviewed him. That's what motivates me to document history and to disseminate it through writing, through documentaries. And yeah, my research, my archive is housed in a 3-bedroom cottage and at the back of my house. And yeah, it's I sometimes it's very difficult to explain it because when I look at it myself, I don't believe that. I sometimes say, did I do all this work? And yeah, but it's work that I've done for the past 38 years. And wow. About 10,000 vinyl, LPs, gramophone, radios, 70s radios, and recently a family from which started township music came to with all their musical instruments of the 30s to the 40s, and I actually built a room for the family, which I dedicated to the Mataka family and township jazz. So that's about my my archive and some of the work that I've done. And the
Thank you.
But
yeah,
maybe
go ahead.
On the other printed material that the periodicals which were there in the 80s and the 90s is the Zimbabwean Women Contemporary Culture Trust Diary, which we gave freely to libraries and to NGOs and to women and other stakeholders. And I still remember there was that other periodical which was called Social Change. I think we managed to have all this because we were funded That's how we could give this freely, because we got funding from donors. But yeah, I think there were more magazines like Horizon. You still remember Horizon?
Yes.
And Motto. Those were sold, but then it's at a very affordable price, because they were also funded somehow, not fully, but they were funded. But then all that now is gone. Yeah.
Yes. Up on the screen right now is an image where Joyce Makwenda is amongst the other artists in the 1992 ZWICCT. And I'll just quickly read the text with Joyce. Joyce Makwenda's nickname is The Bridge. Since 1986, when she began researching Zimbabwe's forgotten township jazz from the 1930s to the 1960s, she has reunited many former musicians and created awareness of their role in the region's musical development. What began as a hobby soon became a full-time commitment, which she funded herself through dressmaking and selling homemade samosas. Now her research has won respect. She gives lectures and produces radio programs about this rich period in musical history. People laughed at a housewife trying to be a researcher, as she says, but a woman must go for what she wants and not wait for permission from men. As a mother, you must love your children, but you must also love yourself. And in front of the image is all the many documents that Joyce has amassed over the course of her very long research. So thank you, Joyce, for this great overview. I also want to do a shout out to Tsitsi Dangaremba and Sifiwe Gloria Ndlovu, who just won the Wyndham Campbell prizes, which is $165,000 US. So it's pretty fantastic that Zimbabwean women are also getting international recognition. So thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Frederick, would you like to speak to some of this?
Okay. In terms of the 80s and 90s in First Nation Native American community, there wasn't a lot of us. There was sort of this movement identifying ourselves politically around the concept of two-spirit. And that started sort of in these groups around Minneapolis, and I started meeting these people, and we all started communicating. In terms of what was going on in Vancouver, I made it my own mission to make sure I was covering as much activity that was going on there with all the different artists that were performing and working in Vancouver, as well as working on two-spirit political, identity through the visual work that we were doing with Kinesis, Western Front Magazine, and Angles. Honestly, there was a ton of support. It was almost like being in a vacuum because there wasn't a lot of other people doing the work. I had a lot of encouragement. I was encouraged to write stories for different papers on two-spirit, on politics, on culture, on Native issues. I was getting job offers all over the place, working with different Native American companies. I started working in New York City at 24 years old for pretty much the Friendship Center over there, and ended up in Oakland, California, working for the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center. So a lot of the stuff I learned in Vancouver and doing those papers and those free publications, I carried that onto my work in the Native community. So I started doing like a free publication with the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center, a newspaper, a 16-page newspaper that I sent out to 200 community-based organizations around the country. And we also did a quarterly paper that we distributed to the organizations as well, just to showcase what was happening in our communities and just to share the news. Let's see, what else did we do? In terms of what was happening, I guess I don't really know what else to say, except there wasn't a lot of us doing the work back then.
Right.
And I hope we did a good job.
We'll go to the next questions just now, but we'll see how you're flourishing in a different way. John, how would you like to speak to this question around print matter, print materials, archives, and what was happening during that time?
Very good. Thank you for touching on historical periodicals, which reminded me about what was happening in the 40s with the magazine called One, the Mattachine Society in the United States, the queer movement in the United States and Canada. And what had occurred, there was quite an active gay rights movement at that time until, of course, McCarthyism and the witch hunts of the 50s. But what was happening at the time in the 80s and 90s, I felt it very repressive and hostile, because in February 5th, 81, we had the bath raids in Toronto. And then in 86, we had the social credit government here in British Columbia bringing in Bill 34, quarantine law. Anyone communicating an infectious disease can be held in quarantine, isolation, and modified isolation. In 96, I remember when the AIDS conference was here in Vancouver, there was a publication called the North Shore News, extremely right-wing, and the editor was Doug Collins. Right. His headline was AIDS Circus in Town. I myself, I went to the location and put up stickers that read hate and lies on their windows, and was held for 2.5 hours by the RCMP of the North Shore. But other than that, I found it quite hostile in the 80s and 90s, and that's why we had to act up. I myself was diagnosed in 1984 with HIV/AIDS, and I identify as a queer man.
Thank you, John. Yes, I remember how active you were and often getting arrested. And I think with a lot of the book that we're seeing now on the screen, we can see your various levels of activism, how engaged you are and you continue to be. So thank you for that. There are questions I see, but we will go to the questions after these brief presentations that contextualize the time and the activisms. So the fourth question, what do you find yourself engaged in today? What is the situation and environment for your cultural activism? What kind of supports are available to you? And if there are no longer any community-based free analog periodicals for you to collaborate with, does the internet provide you what you need? Is it a substitute or platform for the type of community engagement you found in the 80s and 90s? I'll start with John.
Personally, I choose not to access the internet. My community involvement is basically the gay community and the AIDS community. For example, here at our offices, we're presently at is AIDS Vancouver, where I often volunteer with them. What else is there? Sorry.
What do you find yourself engaged in today? And what is the situation and environment for your cultural activism?
I find myself, well, having been ill in 98, I was in the hospital for 3 months. So I'm recovering from that problem I did have, because I do have HIV/AIDS. But other than that, not working with the internet, I'm quite unsure about where we are going progressively because of no analog periodicals. That I see people who believe what they see on the internet and question nothing. For example, I was on Davie Street on my scooter outside Pump Jacks, and there was this protest going down on the sidewalk, and people were carrying signs that read "pederast politicians," right? And I looked up, I said, "Oh, conspiracy theorists." And this one woman responded to me by saying, "Well, it's on the internet, you just have to read about it if it's true," right? Yeah.
I think this is an important point in the sense of someone like yourself who has chosen not to be on the internet. And yet here we are on a webinar, and it's difficult to have the kind of communal, even consensus-based collective, maybe consciousness raising or place of commons, creating a commons. I guess how can we feel less alone in each of our independent community activisms, that's what I think, because my feeling is that in the 80s, before the internet, we were able to collectively come together in a real room and be creating decisions together and having meals together and deciding what to write about. And then today, as you have said, there's all of these opinions about, but there's no real process to create collective sort of decisions, how to better our lives together. And what we see in Vancouver is increased neoliberalism, where Vancouver is really unaffordable to live in. So something that I would like, I guess, also in this webinar, as we think through the situation and in the question period, how to sort of solve some of this isolation that we each have in our activism. And if there are other examples of collectivity in person, then perhaps we can hear about those during the question period. But thank you, John. Next, Frederick, how would you like to describe what you're involved in today?
Okay, so I guess where I'm involved in right now is pretty much education, First Nations education. That's what I've been working in pretty much the last 15 or so years. A lot of that work is involved in improving how they see design, how they see publications, how they see work. I'm walking into organizations that were like, some of them were using risograph still in the 1990s, old style. Everything was full justified, like everything, in my opinion, looked really ugly. So for me, it was always about making everything look really beautiful and really pretty. And also teaching them the need for why design was important in our work and why representation was important in our work. And why, for example, in the school system I'm working in today, I wanted to make sure that the children in our First Nations schools see themselves in our work. They see their color, their skin represented in the pictures and the images that we're doing. And it's not standard education books of generic children, but they see themselves in the work that we're doing. So I've been pushing that with all the books I've been working on, the magazines, the publications, and the design projects that we use at the Manitoba First Nation school system. Just encouraging that culture and representation and good design in everything that I do. And then as a result of that, which has been really encouraging, is that people have been seeking me out for different projects. So I've got too much work now, which is a nice problem to have. So
thanks, Fred.
What else?
Did you design the graphic behind you?
I did that last summer when we're thinking about Canada Day, right? I was thinking about how the center part is like the Kamloops school where they first found those 215 children. So I wanted to represent those children sort of like in a Canadian flag, because to me, like, this is hard to talk about, but Canada caused this and the church caused this, right? So it was really important that these children were found. So
thank you.
It's hard,
yes.
hard to talk about. It's very, it's something all these issues I've been dealing with my whole life. And, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's very powerful. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to ask you of it.
Well, actually, I made it because I want to make a flag out of it. And I made it so that I can flip it over inverse on both sides. And I made crosses to represent the children that were found. And I representing them by crosses because it was the church that was looking after the schools. And because it was the Kamloops church, I sort of over-exaggerated the church at the top of the church. I'm not sure if you can see it. And yeah, but Sorry.
Yeah. No.
I wasn't prepared to talk about that.
No, I think this is very difficult subject matter, but also in relation to erasures, how there are many other sites that are being found, and yet conversation about it is no longer in the forefront of the media. So it would be great to continue to work on whether it's graphics or whether it's zines, to continue. And you and I can chat about that later. Thanks, Frederick.
Yeah,
Joyce, would you like to speak to the fourth question, which is, what do you find yourself engaged in today? What is the situation and environment for your cultural activism? So we're talking about 2022 Zimbabwe, and what kind of supports are available to you? And if there are no longer any community-based free analog periodicals, do you find the internet and digital systems supportive to your work?
I continue to do my research, and I continue to write books. For the past 5 years, I've been writing without even any funding. I think it hasn't been easy, but once you start this work, you don't stop. So I surprised myself for writing a book on women in film, which is actually 100,000 words without funding.
Oh.
Yeah, but when I got to the designing, I got stuck because designers have to be paid. Maybe I will talk to Frederick about that. And, so I'm stuck with this book, which is 100,000 words. The cover, I managed to do the cover, but the book is quite big actually. And I'm also writing about women in literature. It's almost finished. Women in theater, because what happened, I had started a book on women in the arts, but then it became so bulky because I had all these 16 genres of women in the arts. So I decided to split it. That's why I came with the women in film, and then women in theater, women in literature, and so forth and so on. Women and sex and sexuality. And I continue to do my research despite funding myself. Whatever I get, I fund myself, and I continue to do my work. I think some of this work is very addictive. Once you start it, you cannot stop it. And also it depends also on what is motivating me. As I said, that what motivates me is to wanting to document and to make sure that documented stuff is seen by people out there. What I've also been doing is to film film interviews whenever I get the chance of getting a camera, and I've been doing this for my last funding on film documentaries was, I think, in the 90s, but I've been filming using my own funds, and I've realized that I'm actually I can actually edit about 30 documentaries right now.
Oh, wow.
With that I have, So I continue to do my work and getting some consultants here and there. And also the archives is one. I'm managing my archives and funding it as well. And I'm the director of ZWICCT, where we are also trying to get funding for our 30th anniversary, where we want to have all the diaries, the diary notebooks that we we have had since 1992 to 2016, and create a digital archive or library where people from all over the world can read, and we have access to the information. Last year we were lucky, we got funding for digital, our women artists can use the digital space to monetize their work after COVID. So at least that was a relief. Yeah. And I continue to give lectures. I've been giving lectures and talks around the world. In Zimbabwe, I work with music schools. I worked with Zimbabwe College of Music for 15 years, and I even designed the curriculum of popular music and jazz. Yes, and I've been giving lectures and talks in South Africa, University of Natal, University of Cape Town, University of Witwatersrand, and Sweden. I've worked with the audiovisual archives, and in Norway. Recently, I went to Michigan University to talk about Motown in Zimbabwe. It's, you know, when I gave the talk, people didn't even think I was born in Zimbabwe, because Motown raised us, and it influenced our music so much, just like rock music. But when my father heard me sing Motown music, you would say, actually this girl, my daughter is normal, you know, than when I was singing rock music. So Motown music was really revered among the Black community in Zimbabwe. So I gave a talk on Motown in Zimbabwe at the Michigan University. And yeah, I'm still giving talks and lectures. And you know, when you talk about today's activism, where it's not collective, where you don't, like, let me give an example of the women's movement. It's not that sisterhood that we had in the 80s and the 90s. It's gone. It's no longer the same, you know. It's it pains me to see that, but yeah, this is what is happening, and I think
perhaps it's also
not. Let me. Yeah.
Perhaps it's also because of the privatization of funding, because in the 80s and 90s, there was, say, for example, CUSO, Canadian Universities Service Overseas was in Zimbabwe, that helped fund the ZWICCT diary. There was CEDA, which is Canadian Institutes, Institutional Development Abroad. And there were many funders there. And I was just thinking this today, which is, there's actually sanctions on Zimbabwe, and I didn't realize, you know, the scope of this. And I need to look at this again. Like, what does sanctions in to Zimbabwe mean economically? And Zimbabwe is in such a difficult economic place right now. But here you are thriving, right, on a different level, just because of your commitment and dedication. But you may be doing it for no money as well, with no funding. But we also talked a little bit about women being the bedrock of Zimbabwe, like the unacknowledged economy that Zimbabwean women create in that is a culture. Women are the backbone of many small sort of communities that are not, I was going to say erased or not visible. And I think in Zimbabwe, it's very much the case.
Yes. It started in the 30s, like when my paternal grandmother came to the township. there were no jobs for women. But you know what? Women became, they did amazing work to look after the family, to support the family. My grandfather was yet an 8 to 4 job, and my grandmother didn't have anything because the city was not for women. But my grandmother started collecting laundry from white people, started dress designing, started a lot of things to support the family. And she even bought an Austin Cambridge in the 60s. And we used that to get fresh. And what I'm driving at is how women have been the backbone of the economic structure in Zimbabwe. Even during the 2008, you know, when things were really difficult in Zimbabwe, it was the women who were crossing the borders, going to buy groceries in South Africa and bringing it to Zimbabwe. Even now, you know, the informal sector that my grandmother and other women in the township started is still helping to help Zimbabwe economically. And I think women have really been there for the country since not only the informal sector, as I've even mentioned about during the war, but their work is just goes unrecognized. And I hope, hope we will recognize the work that we do is
right.
That of recognizing these women who are not even written about, you know, because, you know, when you write about such women, people will ask you, who is that woman? But she is not known. That's what I get. And I say, she is not known. How is she supposed to be known if she's not written? So I think we need that celebrating these women. This is what I've been doing as a journalist and also as ZWICCT trustee and as coordinator sometimes and as ZWICCT director. I think we need to celebrate these women who are not celebrated.
Right. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce, Frederick, and John. We will now open up to questions. And Jay, maybe you've organized the questions. You will read out the first one for us, perhaps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation so far. The first question we have combines a question from Steve and from Fatima. So from Steve, a question for each of them to answer. How do you see it now? How do things look today regarding those issues from the past? And building off of that, Fatima is so curious how you continue this work or archive it today and how you share your legacies with youth.
Who'd like to start? John, maybe.
How do I feel today? I'm somewhat optimistic because we have done this work in the past and have achieved some goals. We've set the basis for what we can move on from here. The gay rights movement is very strong here. AIDS is being dealt with respectively. Other than that, so I'm quite satisfied right presently.
Thanks, John. Joyce.
I think I said much, but we just like what John has said, we still continue doing what we can do and what we know, and yeah, I think that's what I can say. Yeah, we are not giving up.
We're not giving up. Frederick. Oh, are you muted?
Yeah, what is that question a bit though? I'm just sort of unclear. Like, where are we today? Like,
so I'll ask the question again. How do you see it now? How do things look today? This may be because this was written before we got to question 4, so you can skip if or add to as you wish. How do things look today regarding those issues from the past? And then Steve's question is echoed in Fatima's question. I'm so curious to see how you continue to do this work or archive it today, and how you get to share your legacies with youth. So perhaps
I'll be honest, it's been extremely difficult to get this work done within the First Nation community because there was a lot of resistance to a lot of the work initially. Like when I went to New York City, they were just doing everything the old-fashioned way, the same way they were doing it from the 70s through the 80s. So we were trying to introduce this new technology, working with computers and stuff, and graphic design and desktop publishing, and they just weren't into it. So it was pretty much kicking and screaming the entire way, getting my way, getting them to look at graphic design the way I wanted them to, and bringing my work into the community sort of was very difficult. But it's been very rewarding, and now it's sort of working on its own.
Mm-hmm. And so you share your legacies with youth through your work with the Manitoba First Nation school system, yes?
For sure. Like with the children that we're working with in the schools, we're trying to encourage, self-love, self-respect, love of culture, love of themselves. We want them to see themselves in everything that we're doing, all the work that we're working on. We want them we want them to have what we didn't have when we were children. Because a lot of the time when we were growing up, everything was sort of, honestly, sort of whitewashed. There wasn't anything cultural or specific to First Nations. And how else can you say? Like, just for perspective, in grade 7, grade 8, when I was registering for university, First Nations weren't allowed to take university entrance courses. Like, it was backwards back then. I had to fight for that to get into university at the time. Like, that was a really long time ago, and I'm glad it's a long time ago.
And you've done so much work since then. Yes, thank you. Jay, is there another question?
There is. This is also from Fatima. So inspired by what Frederick so brilliantly shared, so appreciate the context of settler colonialism and racism being brought forward. I think we heard from Joyce about this too in the context of sexism. But how did racism and settler colonialism affect, influence, impact what you covered or not? How more you got involved, why you got into media, whether it impeded you or inspired you to get into media? And how do you see that now for the youth today? Is media still a site of intervention and education? Or are there other directions you'd encourage Indigenous, Black, people of color youth to get into? Any words of wisdom for how to keep building our resistances and tell our stories?
Who'd like to start? Frederick, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I turn the mute off every time. God, I wish I could see this, because I'm the type of person that calls an answering service when they tell you to press 1, 2, 3, and 4. By the time I get to 4, I can't remember what number 1 was. In terms of representation, in terms of colonization, I guess it was pretty much my impetus in getting started when we were first doing this stuff, was making sure our issues were represented, because no one else was doing the work. Talking about these issues back in the 80s and 90s, and including them in our magazine, it felt a little bit being like the token Indian, because there wasn't anyone else doing it. But it was important that we got that work done and out there at the time. What else is that question? Like, is it?
It was in the context of settler colonialism and racism, and how did racism and settler colonialism affect, influence, impact what you covered or not?
Well,
and how sorry, go ahead.
I think it impacts and covers everything in my life. Like, being First Nations, you're dealing with like the 60s scoop, you're dealing with trauma. Like, I'm dealing like with trauma in my past and dealing with all that. So dealing with colonization is not something I can just walk away from. It's something I've had to face my entire life. Right from when I was 10 years old, I went to the doctor's office, and the doctor told me I was just an Indian, and gave me stitches without freezing, and let me know that, you know, I'm not like everyone else. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Joyce.
Yeah, that's why I'm very interested in doing the work I do on township culture, because it shows how, even if the system wanted to break Black people by having them live in the township, which had the houses were just 3-roomed houses, not 3-bedroomed houses, 3-roomed houses. But these people managed to send their children to school, managed to create their own culture, which was very powerful, managed to create a person like me. I'm happy to be what I am. And I'm very proud to be, to have done what I've done. And it is because of those people who came into the township before me. And even, you know, when I became a journalist, I didn't try and at first, I just started writing. And what was I writing about? About my township. And people would like, what is she writing about? But many people now want to be part of that township life, that we became so proud about and started celebrating. And, when I even interviewed, I'll still go back to Ian Smith. When I interviewed him, he said, "Where did you do your journalism? You're very clever." I said, I did it. I said, I did it in Bari. He was just quiet. He didn't know what to say, because he could not expect anyone from Bari to have done journalism in Bari. But that's where I did it, because I did it through my mother, who was a journalist, as I said, the second print journalist. So I think it is very important to talk about your life, which people thought would not go anyway as Black people, and celebrate it, and celebrate the people who have made it. And I'm so proud to be part of Mbari, because many people in Mbari have really made it, despite those conditions that were set for us by the colonialists.
Yes. So to put it into context for folks, Mbare is is a township, but it's also, very poor. It has alternative markets there. It has a huge market, which was really quite vibrant and beautiful to go visit. So it's outside of Harare, and for where again, in apartheid, Black folks had to go and live in a place like Mbare. So I think that your work, Joyce, in promoting Mbare's culture and just the joy and vibrancy that can be found in Mbare is something that people don't know about unless you are doing the work of making all of that culture known. Because I think in colonialism and post-colonialism, there is a tendency to erase what they might consider not real culture, and there's a separation from what they consider real culture compared to what is actually going on the ground, right? Like, what do they call it? Anyway, I've blanked on it. But John, how would you like to speak to this question of settler colonialism and racism, and how did it affect or impact the work that you do?
Well, it empowered me to resist it, of course. I've had many experiences of being arrested and having to deal with systemic homophobia, AIDS phobia, misogyny, racism, and being made very aware of it through the prison system and how the guards had treated each individual, and seeing how other people were being treated compared to how I was being treated. going to the extent that at one time I was hitchhiking through Texas, Ozana del Rio, San Antonio, and was picked up for vagrancy and hitchhiking. And I was made very aware of the racism towards Mexicanos because of the difference how I was treated from them. And I actually did spend 2 nights in jail in Bexar County Jail with 48 Mexicanos. And it was very clear to me how the people are mistreated differently than I am.
Thank you, John. Jay, any other questions?
There haven't been any other questions posted yet. So if anyone else has a question, you're welcome to post in the chat. We might have time for one more, I think.
Okay. I guess the question I would have is, what kind of space or gathering would you love to have right now? But also considering that we're in a pandemic, and what would nourish you? You know, we've been talking about also through John's stories about the AIDS pandemic, and we're in another pandemic again. And have we learned anything from, you know, that previous pandemic to the pandemic we are today? So that's one question. And then the other question is, what kind of nourishment would you love to have? What kind of space would nourish you right now? Let's go to John. What do you think?
Yeah, being made aware of the pandemic is that I think that a lot of people haven't learned from the previous pandemic of how to go about it at this time. I mean, I'm quite aware of how long it takes to make a vaccine, produce a vaccine, compared to like now we have 1 pill a day we do for AIDS. But what was the other question, please? What I would like to see. What would
nourish you?
Yeah, I would like to work in a collective again, like Engels, and how empowering that was to work with other people face to face and move forward together and have some goals that we can both appreciate.
Okay, for sure. Let's make that happen. Frederick, what would you like to say about the pandemic, but also what would nourish you right now?
What would nourish me? I guess output is always nourishing, you know, having an avenue to like put some work out and to encourage work, fostering as well other people who are developing their own, you know, their own skills and their own abilities. Engels was like a brilliant place for us back in the day because it gave us an opportunity to gain so many skills and share those skills. And without a place like that, it's hard to pass along this to the next generation. Mm-hmm. Like everyone's on their own now doing their own media empires through TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, but they're not working together or collaborating as much as they used to. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess having a venue or space to collaborate, I think is so important, and it's not something that we have a lot of today.
Thank you. Joyce?
I think, the pandemic, I wish it had not happened, but I think there are good lessons to learn from what came out of it. For instance, with me, I'm a very old-fashioned person. Sometimes the way I do certain things, and I think because of the pandemic, I learned how to use the digital space and how it can actually monetize the work of an artist, you know. So mm-hmm. I think because I was forced, you know, to do that. Mm-hmm. It's no other way, you know. Mm-hmm. And I think those are the lessons I learned because of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, also remembering that in Zimbabwe, the internet is very poor. And so right now you're in the Mana Matapa Hotel. If we were there, we'd all have a party with you in the lobby of the Mana Matapa Hotel. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Let's really create a space where we can be back in person creating publications. There's a couple of I think Jamali Hassan noted. There's a note here. Embassy Cultural House has an ongoing project called Name the Children, and she would like to connect with Frederick regarding the tribute image that you created. So there's an email address here. Frederick, you could, if you'd like to contact Jamali. And maybe Jay, you could note these down so that we could have them just in case Frederick didn't get them. And then also Jamali says, John, our door at Embassy Cultural House is open for you. So for sure. And the note that Jamali says at the end, that the Embassy Cultural House works in a non-hierarchical cooperative spirit. So Joyce, you may also like to connect with the Embassy Cultural House. Otherwise, thank you to everyone for this lovely conversation and important conversation to see how can we be cultural activists and perhaps create a space, a collective and consensus building space in Vancouver, and particularly in the neoliberal environment that we're currently in. There's a link in the chat window for the after panel Zoom where you can have a beverage. Sorry, I can't serve it to you. I would love to be able to serve it to you. But I will leave it to Tatiana now.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Laiwan. And before we log off, actually, I think John just had something he wanted to share.
Yeah. I'd like to reach out to any of my family members in the Ukraine. If at all possible, please try to contact me.
So you can look John up, John Koshychenko.
Cool.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, John. And any other last words?
Yeah, I wanted to just thank you, Laiwan, and thank everyone here today, John, Frederick, Joyce, for the really for your care and time today in the conversation. It was really nourishing for me. And I hope that we can continue to connect in the Zoom chat. So anyone who wants to say hello and to sort of check in, please join us right after this. I also want to thank the Belkin staff, as well as the staff at the Western Front, as well as AIDS Vancouver for hosting us for this event today and for making it possible. And again, to all of you for being here. I look forward to more in-person events down the road, but for now, I really appreciate you all coming today. And I hope to see you at the next Zoom link in a minute. And thanks again, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And see you in the other room.